two, one. Yeah. Okay. All right. So welcome everyone to today's seminar. I hope my screen is visible. I think it is. So if it's not, please tell me in the chat at any point. Um, as well, I don't think this will become an issue, but if for some reason like you are not comfortable with actually being part of the seminar, it's going to be recorded and posted. I would recommend at this point that you turn off your cameras. And as well, if you don't want your name to appear, change your name on Zoom to something else. If you end up deciding that you want to opt out of the being part of the recording later, message someone on the executive and we will take care of that for you in the editing process. But welcome to today's seminar. Today's seminar, I'm going to keep very simple given that it's a very hot day. And I think a lot of us, sort of want to get out of here as soon as possible. So let's do the seminar very quick. It's just a quick seminar on sort of structure and debate and just making sure everyone is sort of up to speed on how we structure speeches for the different types of things that we have. Notably, I think that this is going to be very boilerplate. So like, I think that like going forward, it's going to be like a lot easier for people to just like, make adjustments here and there based off of your own style as needed. But this is sort of just like the basics of it. And then if you ever want to improvise structure after from this, then, by all means, I think a lot of debaters do that. But let's just go over some of the basics today. So just a general overview of what we're going to talk about today. So one is a general structural guide of like debate overall, like the speech in and of itself. Then I'll be talking about the structure of an argument when you're making constructive arguments. Some of this might be repetitive, but I just think it's important that we get it established. Then we'll be going over the structure of like refutation and rebuilding and like ways in which you can organize that to make it much more efficient. And lastly, I'll just be going speech by speech in British parliamentary format and pointing out how each speech is supposed to be structured generally, but then also talk about some exceptions to those rules as well. So let's start with a general structural guide. There are three things that I think are really important in a debate speech, right? So road mapping, signposting, and flagging. So let's start with road mapping. What is it? It's how you lay out what the structure of your speech will be, right? This is usually done right after your introduction at the beginning of a debate speech. It's really important for two reasons. The first is that it lets the judge know what to expect. And this is very useful, right? A lot of these structural tips that I'm going to give you, one of the benefits of them is always going to be that it's easier for the judge to follow, or it's easier for the judge to anticipate what you're going to say. And that's super important because the judge is the one making the final decision, right? So them having the clearest understanding of what you're saying is a huge priority for you when you decide how to structure your speech. And road mapping allows for this to happen. It also prevents yourself from going off on like tangents or getting too unorganized, simply on the basis that like if you set a structure for yourself, you're just more likely to follow a structure in general, right, when you set up that framework. So what does this look like? At the beginning of your speech, let's say that this is a PM speech, you can say something along the lines of like, in my speech today, I'll be talking about three arguments. The first is this argument, the second is that argument, the third is this argument, right? You've already roadmapped what your arguments are like. Then if this was an LO speech, you might potentially add as well, I will also be doing refutation and rebuilding after, right? Or if this was a whip speech, you might say something along the lines of, today I'll be analyzing for you today, like, two important themes in this speech. The first theme is about this, the second theme is about that. It's literally just an organization of what you're going to say. So what you include in your roadmap is going to depend on what particular speech that you're giving, but it is simply important that you outline from the beginning what the actual components of your speech will be. You don't always have to name what your arguments are going to be, but sometimes it is useful and strategic to do that, to let the judge know and anticipate what types of arguments you might be bringing up earlier in the speech. But the biggest thing is the components of your speech need to be mentioned in this roadmap. Super, super important. Okay, signposting. While a roadmap is an organizing tool at the beginning of your speech, signposting is used to indicate transitions, right? So it's important because it segments your speech and it separates different parts of your speech so nothing is missed, right? So in many instances, I'll hear debaters give a speech where they go from constructive to refutation, but they give me no indication that they're doing so. So it all just sounds like one big argument. That is something you want to avoid. You want to make it very clear that the chair knows what is happening at a particular time. So that's the second point, right? It's easier for the chair to follow along. What does it look like? Very simple. You simply say, now that I've talked about this, whatever you were talking about before, I'll be moving on to this, right? You can have this between your arguments themselves, so between the first and second argument, second and third argument, between your arguments and your refutation, between your refutation and your rebuilding, between two themes, right? When you're just moving on from one component to another, it's very good to just signpost and say, now that I've talked about this, I will be moving on to this. It's a very key structural aspect that just adds a lot of professionalism as well to your debate speech. Flagging, right? You need to routinely like flag, like, you can also like you can flag a lot of different things in your speech in order to emphasize certain points and rebuttal over others, right? It's really important because it's a strategic mechanism to make sure the judge remembers all of your most important points and claims. So maybe you have certain points that you think are more important than the other ones that like you want the judge to remember. Now you might be thinking like, okay, well, what if all of my points are important? Yeah, I think in many instances we're going to only make points that are important to our case, but realistically, the judge is not always going to remember all of them. To be fair, so you want to emphasize certain points or certain claims that you think are the most important to take away. So it would look like some of the following quotes. You could say something along the lines of like, "I would stress that this is the most important thing to take away," and then say what that claim is. If you take anything away from the speech, it is this, and then you can say that, right, to flag an important aspect there. Or even if you didn't buy all of our other claims, here's why the last one will still overcome anything that the other side has said, right? So these are different ways for you to flag and emphasize certain important aspects or important claims that you want to stand out at the end of the debate, that you're worried the judge might miss, and that you want to make sure that they don't end up missing through this mechanism. Okay, let's quickly go through the structure of an argument. I think a lot of people have heard about the PALE method, so I will speed through this. But the PALE method is as follows, right? Premise, analysis, example, impact, and link. That is the basic structure of an argument when you make constructive claims in a debate. The premise is a one-line total, like it's one line total, and it's about what the argument is, right? So literally, you just say the premise of my argument is this, right? This is literally like the title of your argument as well. So if the argument is homework causes stress, right? You would just say the premise of my argument is that homework causes stress. Okay. You can obviously do things differently, right? You can literally say something along the lines of like, okay, my first point is about this, right? You don't always directly need to say the premise of my argument is this, but if you've never done debate before, this is just one way for you to think about the structural aspect of it. You don't really always need to say these sentence starters as long as you understand what the purpose of this thing is. Secondly, analysis, right? 7 to 8 lines about why the argument is true and why the argument is important to the debate. Constantly be asking yourself the question, why, right? If you keep asking yourself why over and over again, you start building very strong analysis. By the end of your analysis, you need to prove why something is true and relevant. It is not sufficient to have just one. If something is true but it's irrelevant, it is not going to help you. If something would be relevant but it is factually incorrect, it will also not help you, right? So your analysis will prove why something is relevant and why something is true, and those two things will help you significantly in proving to the judge that that specific argument is going to be very important for your side in the debate. The analysis obviously is a very clear, large aspect of the argument itself. Then you bring up an example, right? Self-explanatory. You bring up an example that's relevant to the argument, right? Then you bring up an impact, right? Who is this going to affect? How many people will this affect? And why is that important to this debate? And then some ways for you to introduce the impact are given in the quotations there. And lastly, just a link, right? You need to link your argument back to your motion, right? So it's just connecting the two, right? So if my argument was homework causes stress, I would simply say something along the lines of, because it's been proven that homework causes stress, linking back to the motion, this proves that homework should be banned, right? Very clear, very easy, a one sentence link back to what the motion is originally. That is the basic structure of the argument. Structure of refutation. This is just the way I do it. So I think this is just one way to like introduce you to the point. But on my notes, I literally just have a table, right? At the top of my page, if you're using like a regular lined piece of paper, there's like that, like the top line thing, right? So I draw like a T chart basically. On one side of the T chart, I have a heading that says what they said. And then on the other side of the T chart, I have what we say, right? On the what they side, right? This is where like their points go. As they're talking, I start writing what their points are. And write them on this one slide. Then I draw arrows from each point to what my rebuttal is going to be. Why is this important for structure? Because during my refutation, the way I interpret this from my page is I will say something along the lines of what they said on their side was this, give a quick summary of the argument. Here's what we say in response, and then I give my refutation, right? So if you organize your notes, this will also help you structure your speech better because this is the natural flow that you end up getting from this type of T-chart organization for the structure of your refutation. Rebuilding is a little bit similar, but there's an additional component given that rebuilding is actually summarizing three different perspectives. So rebuilding, there's there's three different like sections of the T-chart. The first part is like what we said, right? And this is where your partner's points go, right? What your partner already said. Then you have another one that's like what they refuted with, and then you draw an arrow from your partner's point to the rebuttal that was given in response to your partner's points, and then what we respond with, right? Which is what you're going to respond to the refutation that was provided for your partner's points, right? Or as I like to call it, the refutation of the refutation. So given that that's the case, it's a little bit more complicated, but the natural flow of this in terms of the structure of rebuilding in your speech would be, here's what we said, here's what my partner said, quick summary, here's what they decided to refute with, quick summary, here's what I'm responding with right now in my rebuilding, and then you say that, right? So this also will help you structure your rebuilding much, much easier and much, much better. Let's just go through the speeches that exist in the VP debate sphere. And then I think that'll bring us to the end of the seminar. We can figure out how we structure a debate after in terms of like the debate round that we're running today. But let's talk about the PM speech. So very simple, introduction, roadmap, right? A model for the debate, right? And then you do your arguments and your conclusion, right? No refutation, no rebuilding. This is the structure that you follow for a PM speech. Very easy, very simple, right? A low speech, a little bit more complicated. Intro, roadmap, this is going to stay constant throughout, right? And then you do your refutation of all the points that were made by the prime minister. You do your arguments after for your specific side, and then you conclude this speech. A lot of people question why I tend to recommend refutation before arguments. I think that given that the arguments are fresh in your head as you're writing them down, that refutation is super, super important because the PM is going to give the most amount of constructive from the government side. There's a very high chance that the second speaker doesn't even bring up an argument significantly. So getting that bulk of the refutation done in the first speech gives you a huge strategic advantage, I think, to do it right away at the beginning, right? Once you've taken down their arguments, your arguments seem as well, just much more powerful as well. You can theoretically switch the refutation and arguments around if you so wish. I recommend that you don't do it though. I think refutation first is the better way to go in the LO speech, and then you do the conclusion. The DPM and the DLO speeches are very, very similar, so I'll do them together, right? Intro, roadmap, the same thing. And then you bring up arguments if you want to. This is super optional. I would say in the DLO speech, sometimes it's actually very advantageous to just not bring up an argument, but you can, right? So this is why I put this optional note here, but then refutation, rebuilding, and then conclusion of that speech, those two speeches are very similar. The MG and MO speeches are also almost nearly identical. So I'll do those ones together as well. Intro, roadmap, your arguments, but remember your extension arguments. So at the beginning of those arguments, you would say our extension is as follows, and then you would just make your arguments as if you were making arguments, making sure to include in those arguments why they're differentiable from your front half. Your refutation, of course, of all the things that have been said, and then the conclusion of your speech, right? The only distinction I would say between the MG and the MO is you have one additional speech that you have to refute, which was the speech given by the government extension speaker in the MO speech. But other than that, the structure of the speech is actually exactly the same. And then the whip speeches, your intro, roadmap, your first theme, your second theme, and then your conclusion. Sometimes people like to do like a separate rebuttal section of the whip speech when they do the structure for it. I think it's just much more powerful to integrate your rebuttal. Once you start taking time away from your themes, you might be missing important comparative analysis. So you can integrate your rebuttal into one of the themes. Please do it because that also just simplifies the structure of your speech by a significant amount. I think, Joanne, we can stop recording because I want to take questions.